Splendid Abodes, the official podcast of Toronto Thelema. Exploring, if you will, practical philosophy, from the science and the workings of the mind to spirituality, esotericism, and magic. Stooping down, dipping my wings, I came into the darkly splendid abodes. The Gospel according to St. Bernard Shaw is Crowley's exhaustive response to Bernard Shaw's preface to his play, Androcles and the Lion. Both pieces analyze the Jesus of the Gospels, with Crowley's diving into the parallels with the life of the mystic, as well as the dying god mythos, with abundant quotations from J.G. Frazer's The Golden Bough.
Will, can I try an opening gamut? Yeah. Speaking of absolutely antiquated cultural references, did you
You're
ever
not going to say 6'7", are you?
Did you ever read I said antiquated. Can't get too contemporary.
Things get old
here.
pretty quickly nowadays.
You ever read the Vampire Chronicles? You ever look at the Vampire Chronicles? This is Interview with the Vampire and the Vampire Lestat.
Yeah.
And,
Speaking of celebrity deaths.
Yeah. Oh,
we have,
who kicked it?
Leah, is that her name? Who played the in the second movie?
Oh yeah, she went too young, and everybody misses her. Mm-hmm. So in the first book is just sort of like a historical romance thing, but in the second book we warp into kind of contemporary universe. It takes place in like the 70s or 80s maybe, and Lestat has decided to become a rock and roll star. Mm-hmm. And they talk about how great he is on the guitar and his blonde hair and his sort of like otherworldly voice because, you know, he's literally a vampire. And
the reality being that he'd be more like
it's sort of how reclusive he is and the high notes. And so when I was reading that book, I was imagining that the band, which is called, I think in the book, it's called like the Theater of the Vampire is what the rock band's called. But I was imagining it was Guns N' Roses. It doesn't quite work because Slash and Axl are two different people. But if you imagine Slash and Axl as some sort of composite being, I was imagining it as Guns N' Roses, this otherworldly guitar and this otherworldly voice and this bizarre sort of glam rock music. It seemed perfect to me.
And Lestat's stage name was actually Slaxel?
Slaxel Ross, yeah. But then I later found out that she was actually imagining Iggy Pop. And that the band is the Stooges. Okay. But then also, like, whenever she's imagining like what Lestat looks like, she's thinking of her husband Stan Rice when they first met when they were kids. It was like the physical aesthetic. So, like, in say 100 years from now, if you're going back and you're doing all this, you're listening to this podcast, and
thanks
you're
for
thinking,
the vote of confidence. That
in 4,000 years when people are reviewing this podcast, is it correct to say that like the real Lestat was, you know, either Axl Rose or Iggy Pop or Stan Rice? Is that the real Vampire Lestat? Or is Vampire Lestat then still a fictional character? That's the question.
I think the obvious answer is that it's Keith Richards, because if we're talking about the undead...
yeah, maybe they'll have a new take. But the takes will continue to be revised, obviously, because our podcast and Anne Rice are going to be the most important cultural touchstones going forward into the new millennium. But I would say that the most important thing about Lestat is that he is a vampire. And so even if the character is loosely modeled on various historical figures, if it's not a vampire, then there is no actual Lestat. And so the analogy I'm trying to draw here is for like the people that are like either mythicists or like people trying to reconstruct the idea of like a historical Jesus. Mythicism means you think there was no historical Jesus. And then the academic people that are like, oh no, well, we can extrapolate from what we know and build kind of a hypothetical biography of the person we think Jesus might have been. And but like, what's the most important thing about the story? like the virgin birth, the miracles, the resurrection, and like salvation. And so like if you don't have, if you're just going to rule out those things, if you're if you're going to take a
psychopathy,
you can say, sort of ignore the mythological elements of the story, then it's just Axl Rose. Like, it's not Jesus. And so this is my kind of mythicist argument that okay, whether there was a person or there wasn't, obviously there were probably a half dozen apocalyptic Jewish preachers. Maybe one of them was named, Yeshua, and maybe whether or not you can account for the execution for treason or whatever, like that seems like maybe dubious to me. But like, if that doesn't get you all the core elements of any of the core elements of the story that are what everybody already knows, then are you talking about Jesus, or is it just like I think that we have, especially historians, we have to treat Jesus as the story. And I don't think whether or not there was a historical Jesus is even maybe like a meaningful question. I don't know. What do you think about that?
Well, I think it's the interesting thing for me personally is just the fact that like I was raised Catholic, and when you're raised in that kind of environment, particularly where the religion is taken seriously, it's so inculcated that it's like part of reality. It's part of your understanding and experience of reality. So in the same way that grass is green and the sky is blue,
Right.
Jesus is there watching you.
I had one too, but I was going to let you take it. Very good.
But yeah, it's the reason that's interesting to me is because it's like when you have that experience of reality from childhood, from birth, like it's part of your understanding of existence. There's a whole process of breaking that down, and potentially, unless you're just really attached to it and that sort of thing. Like for somebody like me, it's a slow process of disillusionment. I was extremely serious, wanted to be a priest when I was a kid, had psychotic sort of belief that I was going to be a saint, this kind of thing. And basically...
And now you're in saint school.
Exactly. Now I'm in a weird cult and the fringes of society. It's one of those things that I'm fascinated by, looking at the way that our minds deal with these things for that reason. You know what I mean? Having grown through that sort of process of complete faith, complete dedication, complete suffering through a lot of the different, things that come with that, because reality is full of a bunch of people who don't actually act like they talk. And then eventually getting disillusioned when I started seeing the cracks as I'm growing up and that sort of thing, and following a process that brought me into different roads, and then looking back and seeing that those different roads are even predictable. So I'm just following out certain patterns that are very demonstrable, Mm-hmm. It's like, so basically all that as much to say that, our engagement with these things is largely predictable, is largely formulaic in a lot of ways. But yeah, we have mythos that is generated, and sometimes the myth is just as important as the reality. In fact, more important a lot of the time, because of the way that we engage with it.
I think this is part of what people call like deconstruction. When you're leaving a cult or what they call like a high control group now or something, you do go through this process of gradual separation and removal, and it often involves discovering that people outside of your cult have their own ideas, right? The cult leader seems to be such an engaging, intelligent master of communication or of psychology, of the human identity, right? And then maybe you leave the cult and you read Freud for the first time, and you're like, oh man, Ted wasn't the first person who had this idea. So that kind of blows your mind and can be part of your deconstruction, including the idea that other people might have ideas about Jesus beyond, your Roman Catholic upbringing. I think for me, this sort of this sort of mind expansion, these sort of the spiral of ever widening circle of ideas has actually been part of my indoctrination. To realize that to read the Book of the Law and think of human will being a guiding post for like a basic ontological principle, or something like this master-slave dichotomy. It all seems a bit spooky, but realizing that there's a whole tradition in philosophy and in religious thought that has been talking about this like since Plato and before, helped me realize that Crowley wasn't totally off his own fucking rocker. Yeah. It's the understanding the continuity brought me in deeper rather than encouraging me to deconstruct.
Yeah, I think there's a tendency to, as you become aware of certain things, at first you have a reaction against them as a result. So it's sort of like seeing behind the scenes of a play or something like that, and then suddenly saying, well, this is all fake. And then feeling all the more empowered by that realization that it's fake. And then coming back to the place eventually where it's like, okay, yeah, but the whole idea of getting caught up in the play is its own reward in a lot of ways, right? So it doesn't diminish the fact. So there's still value in that. So, like when I was conceptualizing will to power and in a way that actually made sense to me, initially my first reaction was to fight it and say, well, how do we find a way to do things without will to power then? But then I eventually gradually settled down and realized, oh, wait, no, that's just...
There's no escape from first principles.
Yeah. That's not the point. That's just a reaction,
Wait, human beings are 90% water? How do we do things without water? Come on.
Exactly, yeah. But there's a weird, reaction that people tend to have in that respect.
So I think this is fun, but it's not working the way I was hoping. Gradually, we should be moving towards discussing the Gospel of Saint Bernard Shaw.
The Gospel according to Saint Bernard Shaw by
Aleister Crowley, yeah, which has as one of its major themes this question of mythicism versus what we can know about the historical Jesus. Mm-hmm. So do what thou wilt should be the whole of the law.
Love is the law, love under will.
I'm sorry, I have to use the bathroom.
Yeah. Now that you got the train moving.
Keep that in. So George Bernard Shaw is a comedian, an Irish comedian, contemporary of Crowley, lived a little less than 100 years from 1850 to 1950. When I say comedian, I mean like a comedic playwright, not that he was going around like George Carlin doing stand-up and shit. And so the Gospel according to Saint Bernard Shaw is a commentary on the preface to one of Shaw's major plays. Actually, incidentally, for those who maybe don't know, the second largest theater festival in Canada, Niagara Falls, is the Shaw Festival, named for our titular hero tonight. Mm-hmm. So we've extracted just one section from Crowley's very long paper on Shaw's very long paper, which is in fact on the Gospel. I think when I read this initially, I thought it was going to be a sort of meta commentary on Shaw's comedy, like a deconstruction of some of his jokes with reference to like Christian symbols or something. The way Crowley does in like Book 4, Part 2, where there's this like segue where he talks about like Little Miss Muffet and stuff like that, but tries to give a Kabbalistic breakdown. So I ignored this paper for a long time because I just thought it would be like, a bit of faffing around. But it's actually it deals with a lot of questions about the gospel that are still alive today, either in conspiracy theory circles or in apologetic circles, or even I think some of it's relevant to what they talk about in academia. So it's a difficult paper because it's kind of all over the place, being one crazy guy's commentary on another crazy guy's opinions about a very crazy making text, but way more worth reading than I expected. And we're just looking today at the section on alternative Christs. So the burning question that we always open with, what did you think of this time? Is this your first time reading through these?
Well, I read through the entire paper, but this is actually, even though this is an enormous section of it, it's by no means close to the entirety of it. So it's quite a chunk of reading to do for the whole thing. But what I find most fascinating about this particular book and worth getting into is even just the portion that we chose to talk about today is, in addition to what you've already stated, it's also a perfect opportunity to almost discuss with Crowley his interest in J.G. Frazer and the Golden Bough, because he makes a couple of long quotations from that. And also there's the portion at the end of what we were doing, which he gets into the Plymouth Brethren and their supposed, his sarcastic sort of application of their solution to the enigma, as he says.
Yes, we don't learn very much about the Plymouth Brethren from this paper, unfortunately.
We do learn about his experience with growing up.
But the particular brand of snark is a positive one.
Yeah.
Yes, and I think the Golden Bough is something like 6 million pages long.
Yeah.
And so if we can get just like a taste of it in this way, then that is useful, I think, isn't it?
Mm-hmm. Particularly finding what Crowley found useful about it. So if he's quoting it, then obviously he's pulling the quotes that he finds interesting. So that's helpful, so we don't have to fish through the whole bloody set of volumes just to, get as much as we can out of it necessarily. Of course, that's maybe a worthwhile project, going through the entire thing. I've not done it, but so I can't speak to that. But in this case, I was kind of thinking the portion that Crowley's commenting upon in Bernard Shaw's preface is short enough that we could read it in full.
Yeah, sure. And I had you, because of the two of us, you're the more biblically literate, hopefully. I had you ferreting through the gospel in the last day or two. I remember you said you were reading the Gospel of Matthew, maybe. Mm-hmm. And I wanted to know what your take was on Shaw's take here. So if we read through these first two paragraphs, then you can tell me what you think of them.
Yeah, let's do that.
Let's now clear up the situation a little bit. The New Testament tells two stories for two different sorts of readers. One is the old story of the achievement of our salvation by the sacrifice and atonement of a divine personage who was barbarously slain and rose again on the third day. The story as it was accepted by the apostles. And in this story, the political, economic, and moral views of Christ have no importance. The atonement is everything, and we are saved by our faith in it, not by works or opinions other than that particular opinion bearing on the practical affairs. The other story is of a prophet who, after expressing several interesting opinions as to the practical conduct, both personal and political, which are now of pressing importance, and instructing his disciples to carry them out in their daily lives, lost his head, believed himself to be a crude, legendary form of God, and under the delusion courted and suffered a cruel execution in the belief that he would rise from the dead and come to glory to reign over a regenerated world. In this form, the political, economic, and moral opinions of Jesus as guides to conduct are interesting and important. The rest is mere psychopathy and superstition. The account of the resurrection and the parthenogenetic birth and the more incredible miracles are rejected as inventions, and such episodes as conversation with the devil are classed with similar conversations recorded by St. Dunstan, Luther, Bunyan, Swedenborg, and Blake. So that's the whole rest of the conversation today. We're going to be talking about what Crowley thinks of that. But I was just curious, what do you make of it? Can you find these two different voices of Jesus in the Bible or in the Gospel of Matthew? Does it feel like, two different stories that are maybe by, from two different perspectives that were maybe taken by this Matthew person and stuck together somehow? Or does it seem, do you feel there's more continuity, or like, what do you think of
No, this sounds
Frazer
very
here?
strongly of the smacks of his Shaw's preconceptions and his preconceived argument that he's trying to make, which seems to be very strongly in favor of. Actually, it has been a little while since I read the entirety of the preface, so I apologize if I end up misremembering this, but I think it's like essentially breaking down the mythos aspect as an example of John Barleycorn. Mm-hmm. That's the reference being made here. So the idea of like representing in human form as a mythological image the processes of nature, where you have life sort of with the springtime regenerating, going through its life cycle, dying, and then being dormant for the winter and coming back to life in the spring. And you have the harvest period and that sort of thing. So we have life arising, disappearing, and re-arising. And he's making this reference to that as a way of breaking down the mythological aspect, whilst trying to argue for the legitimacy of these preconceived notions about the politics that Jesus was trying to put forth. Certainly in Matthew, it's much more, and throughout the Gospels, there's a large emphasis on legitimizing Jesus by continuously referencing, saying, and then this happened in order to fulfill the prophecy of, so-and-so from the Old Testament and whatnot.
I see. A lot of those elements are being brought in, like maybe the riding into Jerusalem on an ass, or the palm leaves thing, which is part of the same moment, or the birth in the city of David. Like, that's Matthew's where some of that stuff is starting to come in. Is that correct?
Yeah. So there's regular references to these ideas, like even just like certain healings or going to certain places. The fact that he was born in Nazareth, or he wasn't born in Nazareth, sorry, he was brought there after the fact so that it could fulfill such and such a line.
Well, so he's a Nazarene. So this story, he's probably born in Nazareth, but if he existed at all. But there's this story of the traveling to Bethlehem, because Bethlehem, I guess, is the city of David, and the Messiah needs to be born in the city of David.
Yeah, well, he was born in Bethlehem, and according to Matthew, he was then hidden in Egypt so that they could avoid Herod killing all the children under 2 years old. So, and then they ended up going to Nazareth, and it literally pretty much just sums it up as, then Joseph took them to Nazareth, and this fulfills, X reference.
I see.
So it's that type of a thing where there's a lot of those types of things where it just feels like it's kind of just throwing in, well, this legitimizes this prophecy, this fulfills this prophecy, and that sort of thing. So, but yeah, as far as Shaw goes, it is very starkly, I mean, obviously he's going to have a point of view. He's going to be coming at it in a certain way, especially as a comedic writer, a playwright. And, but he is pretty heavy-handed in that respect, where it's cut and dry. And I can tie that back to what I was talking about, like with my own upbringing being very Catholic. There's a reaction against that, right? Like you when you're reacting against something, you're taking the opposite side. So it's like he's speaking about the mythological aspect where it's patently ridiculous. We all agree that this is, these things are examples of psychopathy and that sort of thing, So your view, having read the entire paper, because I started to read from the beginning and then we agreed to focus on this passage, so that's what I did, is that it is these moral and legalistic pronouncements of Jesus that are what's important to Shaw. It seems to be, yeah. And I think Crowley's very astute in pointing out the fact that a lot of Jesus's prescriptions are specifically to people who are planning on being aesthetics, and like people who are trying to be spiritually dedicated, going apart from society, not teaching it to just the general masses that you're supposed to be doing these things.
So there's I think it's interesting, these two stories that Shaw wants to tell. The first story of, the death, resurrection, and salvation, and that being what's important to the apostles. Like, if that's what it's important to the apostles, like the true followers of Jesus, my first, instinct was to be like, that should be what's important to us. Like, that's what's important to the smart people who actually know what's going on. And in this version of the story, Christ's like sermons and legalistic pronouncements and stuff like that are of less importance. And so that's kind of what I thought Shaw was saying. But then in the second paragraph, where he starts talking about, there's another version of the story, that's for everyone else, not for the apostles, where the moral and legalistic and other pronouncements are of key importance. And then, like, in that version, he still dies on the cross and is still resurrected, but he's crazy for wanting that. It's like this death drive, that's maybe makes the difference. That in one case, he just ends up being crucified, and in the other case, he's like, oh, like, I guess gods are crucified. So, like, what if I went around whipping money changers and shit and trying to get myself charged with treason. So I just thought that was weird that, like, well, there's not two versions of the story. There's at least four. Like, there's Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and they're all distinct. And then within them, they have distinct little sub-elements where they're borrowing from each other and borrowing from other sources. So it's not two stories in the way Shaw kind of thinks it is. It's perhaps several dozen stories, and that it's weird that you would say the crucifixion and resurrection has this inherent value, but then also in another story it's crazy and stupid and Christ is obviously a lunatic. So I found that was a bit confusing. But anyway, so but what Shaw thinks is that the moral and legalistic pronouncements of Jesus are what's most important, and you concur with that view, having read the whole paper.
I mean, yeah, the way that Shaw talks about it, it does sound like essentially he's saying there's an emotional reaction to the story of Jesus, an emotional audience, and then there's a rational audience. That's what it sounds like. And there's the people who speak like this tend to be of our type, the people who like to read a lot. The people who like to, get hoity-toity about themselves and stuff like that. So, like, the idea of, like, appealing to the intelligent people and that sort of thing, as opposed to the rabble. But yeah, I definitely think, I have to agree with Crowley because he's also gets into the various audiences. At one point, the structure of Crowley's discussion here goes through a few different topics just for an overview. Like, I think if I remember just off the top of my head, it goes roughly with starting with referring to Patanjali and ideas about yogic practice. So practicing yoga in the East, and that would be comparable to some of the things that Jesus preached, and of course that also sort of hints at the idea of, like, what happened in that period between the age of 12 and 30 that you were talking about, which is the conspiracy theory kind of level of sort of thing. But there's also then he will talk about the nature of ceremony and ritual, the fact that a lot of the things that are being described in Jesus's life are not really realistic, because if these things happen in reality, then it'd be a very small thing for them to toss him in prison and have him executed at an earlier stage of the game, as Crowley puts it. But he's sort of pointing out the fact that there's a ritualistic sense to these things. It really fulfills a lot of religious practices and that sort of thing as as sort of. What do you want to call it? Like a morality play or something like that. But then there's the portion where he's comparing, probably throughout, but like comparing to other cultural sort of signifiers. So in other religious practices in the ancient Roman Empire and in different areas of the world, there's comparable sorts of situations that you can draw parallels to various important points in Jesus' life that are also reflected in these other sorts of places. So he's pointing out that at the time, the world had been opened up by trade, so that there's a lot of exchange of ideas and culture and that sort of thing, so that that comes into play. We have a lot of resonances with all these other sort of cultural ideas and religious practices and that sort of thing. And then we get into where I might be skipping something, but he gets to the point where he's talking about Paul, who was once Saul, who is the real promoter of Christianity in the early days. And he's pointing out the fact that Paul, is motivated to try and reach a bigger audience. Maybe initially he's trying to go for the ones that are really hardcore and that sort of thing, but then he starts to open it up to a wider appeal, and he lists like all the ways in which this can appeal to these different sorts of parts of society in different places. And of course, we have the closing Plymouth Brethren sort of section as well that I mentioned.
So let's try to break it down into some manageable chunks. First of all, this John Barleycorn thing that comes from Shaw. You're saying that's sort of like his preface. He wants to talk about Jesus in terms of mythological context, right? This in terms of him as an example, the Jesus myth as an example of sort of like a ancient world kind of fertility myth thing, where the death and resurrection of God is symbolic of the going through the seasons or something.
Well, the problem is I'm only been focusing on this small portion that we've chosen, so I may be mistaken in it being specific to Shaw. It may have been Crowley introducing that idea, but either way, I'm pretty sure it was Shaw. I could be wrong on that, though, so I should be careful about speaking definitively.
Well, let's imagine that it is, because that's interesting. Because while Shaw is going to talk about alternative Christs in 2 paragraphs and say there are these 2 Jesuses, there's the mythological Jesus who is in this fertility tradition, who dies and is resurrected for our salvation, and is a metaphor for the turn of the seasons and the harvest and stuff. And then there's this other Jesus who's an enlightened preacher and who says good things about philosophy. Crowley gives us a half dozen or more Jesuses. And he does one of the ways he does this is by, like you're saying, putting Jesus in the mythological tradition of fertility myths from Osiris, Persephone, and the most important one he thinks is Dionysus. We'll sort of get there when we get there, but this is a thing that the poor kind of mythicist sometimes does, right? Like, you remember this movie Zeitgeist that came out in 2012? And it was all about the 9/11 attacks, which is a fine thing to make a movie about. But it opens with this long thing where it talks about how, Horus was born of a virgin, heralded by a star in the east, accompanied by the 12 disciples, crucified on a cross, and then resurrected 3 days later. And then, like, Osiris says the same thing, and then Dionysus has the same thing, and Mithras has the same thing. And it's all just made up. Like, some of these stories have some points of harmony, but the Jesus archetype, that myth of including all those 8 points or whatever it is, there's no other story that has all of those subsidiary elements. It's nonsense. But the motivation for people to do that is to evidence that the Jesus myth is a myth in a mythological tradition, and so searching for a historical Jesus is nonsense. This is all just, a story about the pattern of the stars or something. And it's not exactly what Crowley does. Crowley is a lot more nuanced than this Zeitgeist movie. He talks about parallels that I think largely actually exist. But he does this weird thing where he's chasing this mythological current and trying to see how the Jesus story works in the context of like comparative mythology. But he also talks about Jesus's lost years and the theory that maybe Jesus spent time either in India or with an Indian guru, which is where Crowley starts. So let's start there as well. But that seems to be a historical Jesus hypothesis. Like, you can't say, since there's nowhere in the literature that says Jesus spent time in India. You can't say that Jesus is a mythological figure who spent time in India. If you're going to propose that he did that, it has to be a person that did that. It's not like we can't say, Batman is a space alien if there was no such person as Batman and there's no Batman book where he's a space alien. You can't just, you would have to be imagining that, like Axl Rose, the Axl Rose version of Batman actually was a space. So there's, even though he's making what in contemporary times would seem like a mythicist argument, he does have this very strange idea of what the historical Jesus might have been, and has some defenses for that.
Yeah, and I mean, he doesn't say, unless I'm just forgetting the particular passage, I don't think he says outright that Jesus went to India and practiced with yogis. I think he basically says these aspects are recognizable and explainable in the context of Indian yogis and practices of the East. And of course, we have the crossover of we have a lot of exchange of ideas and people traveling the wider world. So the implication is there that this basically on his argument that this is what it sounds like was going on with Jesus, and this makes sense of it to think of it this way. It's not a justification necessarily. It's just sort of a nuance to the way that I believe Crowley was presenting this stuff.
Yeah, at least in the section of the yogi Jesus, he does not talk about travels in India. There may be a section later where just for one sentence he briefly mentions the possibility of travels in India. But
and the other thing is, like, if he says, does he say India or does he say the East? Because the East is a big concept as well, especially for the time of Jesus. Because the way that we think of the East now, we have a different demarcation of that.
Right.
So, like, for instance, Iran might have been the East.
Yeah, sure. There's a couple of weird things. Does Jesus take his shoes off whenever he goes inside? Is that like an important thing in the gospel?
I feel like there's something connected with that, yeah. But
Crowley makes a big deal about this shoes thing.
Yeah.
He says he says it's not spooky. It's just because India is flat. And so there's no drainage. And so the land tends to be a little bit dirtier than it is in places that are not flat. So when you go inside, you take off your shoes because your shoes are filthy. And this is supposed to be like the things that Jesus does are spooky in the Jesus context. But if you imagine that he was traveling in India and picked up those customs, then it just makes naturalistic sense. It's not all, about, this is the enlightened from God way to behave. These are just the customs and traditions that I picked up from my guru or something.
Not only that,
does Jesus take his shoes off all the time in the gospel? I can't remember.
Does, there, I think it's like you're thinking of it like this is directly drawing it to India, but it may not even have to go so far afield. He may be speaking to English people about a Middle Eastern context.
Yeah.
I know that Americans apparently don't, they wear their shoes inside from what I've heard. But it's like Canadians, I'm used to Canadians taking their shoes off when they go inside. I don't know,
Canada's gross.
I haven't done a study of these
disgusting.
things, but we've got a lot of weather here.
Yeah. It's just, it's so flat that there's just shit everywhere.
But that's the thing. It's like, I think, because Crowley's well-traveled, the way I took it was not that he was saying that this is just in India. It's like, as much as the Middle East is a foreign place to Protestants. I mean, we're really talking about Protestants for the most part because it's like English, British people that are the audience of these writers for the most part. Obviously, it goes farther afield than that. But my point being that it's like that seems to be the audience is like people who probably haven't spent a lot of time in the Middle East or anywhere in India or in China or in any other regions of the world outside of their own country for the most part,
Yeah. Okay. So that's it. Kind of interesting. So you're seeing this because I was imagining that Jesus goes, Jesus disappears and spends some time with some guru, and then Crowley says, either the old man dies or Jesus becomes an adept, and then he's allowed to go traveling, and he catches the teaching bug, and he roves around like a yoga master, like a guru, taking on disciples and begging for food and doing all the things that Crowley says he did when he was in India. Being a yogi, and how common this lifestyle is, like in the East. And so I'm imagining this being a conversation about how unique and interesting Jesus was in his own time and his own context, and how he was able to be like maybe such an interesting person, because like, why is he behaving so strangely? Well, it's because he had some master that was from the East. But of course, Syria, Jerusalem, Palestine, these places are like, you might think of them as being like Near Eastern places. So you're thinking maybe this, I don't know to what extent this yoga tradition, because he specifically calls it a yoga tradition, talks about being in the same context as Patanjali, who would have been writing maybe around the same time, to what extent that would have existed in like Jewish Syria or something, whether he would have needed to travel, say, to Egypt or Iran or some place further away to get access to this kind of tradition.
And I think that's the thing. It's like, I could be totally wrong, you could be totally right, but the reason I bring it up is mainly because of the fact that it's like, if you go in with the preconceived notion that it is an argument for him having gone to India, you will tend to read everything that way, right? So it's basically like just to bring in the idea of having a little bit of nuance just in case.
So the question is not, why did the apostles think Jesus was weird? The theory might be, no, the apostles understood the Jesus archetype because there were yoga masters all over the place. It seems weird to us because we don't have that. I see. I see. That's a different reading, and lets Crowley off the hook for some of his for some of the possibly crazier versions of this take.
Which, I mean, like, he is obviously drawing parallels directly to India, so it's like, you may still be totally right, and I'm not trying to say that I'm right in this. It's just a different take on it. But I mean, he has clear examples from India in that respect, so it's a nice, easy parallel to draw, certainly.
And this is not just Crowley saying these things, right? There was I looked it up. Did I write it down? No, I texted it to you. But there was a let's talk about yoga. One of Crowley's contemporaries, the master Paramahansa Yogananda, who was one of the earliest teachers of yoga to come to California and set up a permanent school in California. A lot of his writing, and it's not original to him, it comes from his master and his master's master, includes this idea of Jesus the yogi, and tries to market yoga to Western people by translating things like nirvana, things like samadhi, things like, by using the English phrase Christ consciousness. And that we realize that we are sons of God, by practicing yoga. So there's an attempt in this period by yoga people proselytizing in the Americas and in England to English-speaking people to draw this continuity with Jesus and create a yoga that works for a Christian world. And Crowley, who spent time in Ceylon in this context where there was another major teacher working with what's the guy's name, the mountain climber?
With Eckenstein?
Working with no, that can't.
Are you thinking of Alan Bennett?
Yeah, thinking of Bennett.
He wasn't a mountain climber.
No,
he was the big Buddhist guy in the Golden Dawn.
I thought Bennett taught Crowley to concentrate on the side of a mountain.
He did.
Yeah. So wouldn't he have to have been a mountain climber to be up a mountain?
Crowley thought of both of them as his teachers at various points. So, but Bennett was like the huge, one into yoga and stuff.
An important early English Buddhist. But yeah, so Crowley's Crowley's part of this tradition of this movement of bringing authentic yoga into the West for
And he
the
also
first time.
references what you're talking about
Yeah.
here with these writings. I don't know if it was the same author or a different one, but it sounds like the same author. In this paper, he references it. And so to undermine my own argument or from earlier, it sounds very much like he's trying to make this same argument, that there's a parallel there, which is kind of interesting because it's like that argument also speaks to, you were saying earlier, how the mythicism thing is often used to discredit things like Jesus, for instance, the Jesus mythos, and to deconstruct it so as to discredit by pointing to parallels in other cultures and that sort of thing. But there's another side to that coin where it's like with the Golden Dawn and a lot of the spiritual people in that timeline, there was a tendency to try and use parallels between different cultural and religious movements and stuff to show a commonality and to draw commonalities in order to essentially say they're all looking at the same thing, and we can use that to get a closer look at that same thing. So that sounds like what this yoga teacher was doing as well.
Anyway, it's 1887. A Russian cat named Nicholas Notovich claimed that while at Hermes Monastery in Ladakh, he learned of a document called Life of Saint Isa, Best of the Sons of Man, Isa being the Arabic name for Jesus in Islam.
Isa.
Notovich's story translates in the Life of Saint Isa, was published in French. Anyway, it's sort of about Jesus having been there, at that time. And then Max Mueller, our hero, who is the primary editor of the Sacred Books of the East text, I don't know what, he FaceTimed the guys at this monastery, whatever it is, telegrammed, and they came back with, we've had no, white visitors in 15 years and don't know what this document is that he's talking about. So it's this sort of like pop mock history came out, was immediately debunked, but stays with us till today, this idea of the lost years of Jesus being, spent traveling in India.
Well,
and it sounds to me sometimes like Crowley's being influenced by this current, but also I like what you're saying about, Jerusalem just being the Near East.
Yeah.
And so that maybe there was some of this culture hanging around.
Yeah. I mean, reading ancient Roman stuff and that sort of thing, it would refer to that as the Orient, meaning East. So that was, that's where I'm thinking of for that. But it does, to undermine my own argument, the way in which Crowley's talking about these things does sound like it's corroborative evidence pointing towards something like that.
So here's some of Crowley's evidence, and it's just comparative evidence. He has the Yoga Sutras of Patanjali in front of him, probably in the Vivekananda translation, because that's what he recommends to us. And then he has some instances in the Gospel, and he says, in a hollow, protected from the wind, a man should compose himself. The power of working various miracles is also given by yoga, Patanjali says, by making samyama on the form of the body. The power of perceiving forms becomes obstructed, the power of manifestation in the eyes being separated. The yogi's body becomes unseen. This explains perfectly the miracle recorded in the Gospels, where they took up stones to stone him, but passing through in the midst of them went on his way. And so there's some episode in the Gospel where Jesus is going to be stoned, and he escapes being stoned by simply walking away. Nobody, he just leaves and nobody stops him. And he says, like, well, if he could turn invisible, a la Patanjali, maybe that would be how he just walked away.
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
And, or Patanjali continues, karma is of two kinds, soon to be fructified and late to be fructified. Making samyama on that, or by the sign called aristhya portents, the yogi knows the exact time of the separation from their bodies, and this explains how Jesus foretold the time of his death. Jesus doesn't exactly foretell the time of his death, but there's various places in the Gospel where he seems to be making allusions to the idea of his own death and resurrection. This is what Shaw is going to talk about as being like the psychopathy of Jesus, the zealous martyrdom, death urge. And Crowley says, well, if Crowley had practiced this particular Patanjali exercise, then he would be able to, then he would have been able to predict the time of his death, and then, maybe talk about that, make these oblique references with his apostles and stuff like that.
Yeah.
And so this is the kind of evidence that Crowley has that Christ was a yogi, because some of his miracles, in fact, probably most of his miracles, are explicable by exercises taught specifically in the Yoga Suttas of Patanjali. And I thought this was an ancient text, but I looked it up. The earliest possible date for this is something like 40 BC, and as late as possibly 200 or later. Anno Domini,
which is still ancient by modern standards. But
sure, but
not as ancient as
but not ancient enough to have been in the zeitgeist and all across the Near East by like they wouldn't have access to, say, translations of this into Arabic at the time of Christ. So either it has to be it won't have been that Patanjali was Christ's direct teacher or anything like that, or even someone who knew him. It would have been like that this was part of a tradition that was in the air, that was crystallized and written down by Patanjali, but that it was more widespread than that, and descriptive of something Christ was also doing, rather than, he had this book and was practicing these exercises.
Now, I also want to bring to mind, just to lay in the another way of looking at things with this paper as well, just to sort of meet Shaw at his dual Christs and see him one better. We have the discussion that we have currently right now, where Crowley's criticizing his interpretation and pointing to these different ideas that we've already talked about. There's also this paper for Crowley seems like an opportunity to hint at and bring out a lot of ideas pertaining to we have constant reference in Crowley to like the phallus and Katice and seed and that sort of thing, and the sun as being like the Thelema is described as a solar phallic religion or whatnot. So that comes into play here as well. I think this is one of the reasons he's so interested in this subject as well. And a lot of the stuff that he's talking about is very much about, the death, resurrection as a metaphor for the sun, the death and resurrection of the sun and of life in the seasons and that sort of thing. This is something that's very important, and that I think is worth sort of bringing up as it comes up throughout the paper as well. There's one little thing that I want to reference here, which may not actually directly apply to that, but it's just in addition to what you've already read regarding the yoga portion there. We are also to note the following phrase of Patanjali: the pain-bearing obstructions are ignorance, egotism, attachment, aversion, and clinging to life. Ignorance is taking that which is not eternal, impure, painful, and non-self for the eternal, pure and happy self. Egoism is the identification of the seer with the instrument of seeing, that is, the body of the mind. Attachment is that which dwells on pleasure. Aversion is that which dwells on pain. Flowing through its own nature and established even in the learned is the clinging to life. And Crowley picks this up. This is the very teaching of Jesus as approved by Mr. Shaw in every respect. Much more could be said, but this appears to me to be enough as a clear identification of the teaching of Jesus with the universal and much more ancient doctrine. Maybe not so ancient as according to what you were saying. There is no new item, he says.
So thank you for pointing this out, because this is something we might have missed by just how fast we've started going. So for Shaw, the important thing about the gospel is the moral and legalistic proclamations of Jesus. The other stuff is magic or psychopathy, he says.
Yeah.
And Crowley complains about Shaw's cherry picking. He says, taking, 5 verses from the gospel and saying that that's the whole thing that matters, and throwing out the rest. And so part of what Crowley's doing here is trying to make a case for the value of the rest by putting it into mythological context, by putting it into some, by making reference to the miracles, the stuff that Shaw thinks of as psychopathy as being, no, these are part of the yoga tradition, for example.
Yeah.
And so by reinvigorating the gospel narrative with value by super adding, but by adding these other threads of context. Shaw says there are alternative Christs. There are 2. Like I said, Crowley has about 6 or 7, or maybe up to a dozen or something. But another of Crowley's complaints, and this is another way he tries to convince us that this is Patanjali Yoga, is that these moral and legalistic pronouncements of Christ are important. Crowley agrees that they're important. Crowley does not agree that they are general guidelines for society. He thinks they are ways to clean up your life so you can focus on yoga.
Yeah.
Meekness, for example, is not a valuable skill to cultivate in regular life. You're not going to get very far with, Roman senators being meek all the time.
Yeah, and the way that he describes, describes forgiving your neighbor and forgiving the transgressions done against you and that sort of thing, very much on that point. So it's not getting hung up and creating conflicts and...
It is a good way to get people to leave you alone. So the meek shall inherit the earth because they're the ones doing yoga. If you want to be totally alone and left alone and not be distracted by arguments with your neighbors and stuff, you just go, okay. I have to go to my closet now and meditate for 14 hours.
Yeah.
And so Crowley accepts that these directives are important, but that they're a sort of Patanjali style yama niyama for productive practice rather than the best way to live, period.
Yeah, including things like Jesus talking about if your left hand offends you or if your eye offends you, then it's better to cut it out and enter the kingdom of heaven without it rather than to suffer on account of it and that sort of thing.
I always hear those verses in the Tom Waits voice because there's some song where he goes, "If thy right eye offends thee, you must pluck it out."
It's just there's stuff like that in there where it's it makes me think, okay,
that's a Jesus I would follow.
I can't think of a single Christian who's followed through on that advice, So yeah, it's kind of reasonable, and not just that, but I mean many other things as well. So I was suggesting maybe it would be good to actually choose chunks of the Gospels to do a deep dip on in the future as well.
Yeah, I'm down with that. I would love to. I would love to look at the Gospel of John. Actually, I think that's the sort of the spookiest one, and we could have some fun there. But the synoptics are also.
And the Sermon on the Mount actually has a lot of potential fruit there, and there's there's any number of things that we could eventually get to, but yeah.
There's another thing that's important. So Jesus's customs are obviously customs of the East. So that tells us he was traveling in the East, which might just mean the neighborhood.
Yeah.
But Jesus's miracles are accounted for by advanced stages of Patanjali's yoga practice. Jesus's moral codes are sort of equivalent to yamas and traditional yama and niyama.
Exactly.
And then also the lost years really are lost. And there's one piece of textual evidence for that Crowley gives where people are arguing about whether or not they recognize Jesus. They say, "Is this not the carpenter's son?" Nobody says, "Is this not the carpenter?"
Yeah.
So there's no evidence of him ever hanging out in Nazareth or Bethlehem or India, wherever, doing any work.
Yeah.
Because when people recognize him, they go like, "Oh shit, is that Joseph's kid?" They never say like, "Oh yeah, that's the guy that did my drains."
Yeah.
Yeah. So this is like, so these are the four big pillars for Crowley of the Jesus as yogi argument. Next section is called the Jewish prophet Jesus, and this is going to be hard for us to talk about because I don't know when the last time either of us have read the book of Daniel. A lot of these seem to be sections where Jesus is abusive to people. And contrary to his own code of meekness, and he says this is in the tradition of Jewish prophets who are always debating and rebuking and challenging. And he gives some examples of passages from, say, Matthew, where he's saying, "Oh, your whole city, will be brought low in the days of the final judgment," and then saying this is exactly the same as something in Isaiah. And then I went back and I read through the passages of Isaiah, and other than the fact that passage in Isaiah is also a rebuke of a whole city that will be brought low during the last judgment, that he doesn't. It's not correct that. Crowley says, like, the form of the rebuke is identical. That's not true. But it is also a rebuke or something. How do you feel about all this?
This passage I think I did took the least interest in, to be honest with you. But I mean, it's really, like I say, that's really sort of where we have a lot of the four gospels are a big theme for them is the idea of legitimizing Jesus as being this prophet. So that seems to be an important aspect of things.
Yeah, I agree with that. And then there's some attempt to talk about Jesus as the reincarnation of Elijah, or maybe to talk about John the Baptist as the reincarnation of Elijah. And Jesus does say things about coming to reinforce the laws of Moses, oh, I have my own summary, it's okay to heal on the Sabbath because healing's necessary, or like there are types of work that we do on the Sabbath. Like there's these subtle revisions he brings, but largely he talks about teaching and reinforcing certain things. And I can't remember which book of the Old Testament is Jesus's favorite. Maybe it's like Deuteronomy or something. But he does have these sort of like old Jewish kind of like codes that he's trying to enforce and trying to teach and try to renew interest in. He is in a tradition, but it doesn't seem to me that Crowley does the best possible job of defending that here, because let me just quickly read through it again, but I think all he does is say, like, Jesus' message is about meekness, but here are times when he's been prepared to be aggressive in a similar tone to Jewish prophets, nodding to them. I think there's other ways that I've seen this defended more successfully by people who aren't Crowley.
Yeah, I mean, to be honest with you, I think the more we, look at these things, the more we can actually speak a little bit more to them or explore them a little bit more deeply. But just on having returned to, like, as you mentioned, I was reading through Matthew again recently, trying to go through the Gospels again, and it does, on that, my first superficial impression, taking notes and all that sort of thing, it does read very much like after the fact, kind of making sure that everything's being covered. It's like, I did not come to replace the laws or tear down the old laws. I came to reinforce them. At the same time, I'm arguing for these things that are kind of like may not seem as familiar from those Old Testament writings and that sort of thing. So there's like trying to shoehorn and make sure all of these things get represented. There's a little bit of an impression of that. I really get the sense that the Gospels do sort of have that tone to them where it's like they were definitely dressed up after the fact to try and convey the ideas that were part of the agenda.
Here's So, okay, well, here he says Jesus even acknowledges Daniel in Matthew 24:15 as his authority. The return to God, the repentance of the people, the restoration of the kingdom are practically the sole theme of Jesus, the patriotic Hebrew prophet. Sufficit. So, that end of conversation. He begins with this element in the character of Jesus needs no elaboration and ends with sufficit. So he doesn't want to talk about this too much anyway. And here's some examples he gives, like carrying on the tradition of Isaiah, Jeremiah, and Ezekiel in such passages, for example, as Matthew 11:21-24, which have been quoted above as the evidence of the inclination of Jesus to use threats. Compare this with Isaiah 17, the burden of Damascus. Behold, Damascus is taken away from being a city as it shall be a ruinous heap, and 20 other passages. So like, and like I said, I don't need to read it now, but Matthew 11:21-24 is Jesus saying, like, you know, this whole town will be condemned.
Yeah, they'll regret it.
Out. Yeah, or the fourth chapter of Matthew repeated in the other synoptics is precisely in the style of Daniel 12:1-3. And at that time shall Michael stand up, the great prince, which standeth for the children of thy people, and there shall be a time of trouble, such as never was. At that time thy people shall be delivered, every one shall be found written in a book, and many of them that sleep in the dust shall awake, and some to everlasting life, and some to everlasting contempt. Sometimes it's about using threats to, like, rebuke people who are being unfaithful, and sometimes it's just about him being like an apocalyptic Jewish priest, appropriate to the context of, you know, like desert recluses, and you could talk about there's all kinds of stuff to talk about here that people are talking about now, in terms of what John the Baptist's cult was, and how Jesus is a member of that cult, and how, you know, maybe John, after the Baptist dies, Jesus is being structured as the new leader of that movement. It's loads of fun, but it's not covered in depth here, so we need to move on. Sufficit.
So there's one little passage, again, I want to intersperse things whenever I can here, but I'm just going to read this. So regarding sort of like, we have, they are really one power, by the way, on the theory, all material things are illusions caused by ignorance, and one who has conquered ignorance by the realization of the truth, I and my Father are one. By realization, we do not here mean the mere formula of the mental conception that it is so, but something far deeper. And that is to say, one who has conquered ignorance and realized that knows the immediate causes, which are fine as opposed to gross, and spiritual in their nature, so that by modifying by the power of the mind that mental state which causes the illusion of gravitation or the impermeability of matter, he can suspend these phenomena and rise through air or pass through a brick wall. The above discussion of the subject is extremely summary, but we trust that it will be found conclusive. And I wanted to sneak that in there because of the fact that it sort of says something about Crowley's interpretation of magic.
Yes. So this is skipping back to the section on yoga and doing. And I think it's valuable you bring this up. That what yogic powers are, what saintly powers are, is a transcendence of the illusion of Maya. Once you break through to the what's on the other side of the real world, and realize the, you know, and see the real machinery of the universe on the other side of the illusion, then something about that allows you to manipulate, allows you to sort of manipulate the code and do things in the open quotes, real world, end quotes, that seem like cheating. And so this is the sort of like the Matrix 1 theory of magic, where we live in a simulation, and once we realize that it is a simulation, we can dodge bullets and leap tall buildings as single bound, and all this stuff.
I think there's a double entendre there as well that I want to point out with where he's referring specifically to the phrase "I and my Father are one." So the realization of that being more deep than just the surface level of it. And the choice of wording in that I and my Father are one might sort of spark off the imagination a little bit in the right ways. But
yes. So what frustrates me about that, this whole line, is that there doesn't seem to be a mechanism. Just because I know that it's not real doesn't mean I can control the whole situation.
Yeah.
I know that Friends isn't real.
Yeah.
But the last episode still didn't go the way I wanted it to, Darren. Just because I know that it's made up doesn't mean that I can turn loaves into fishes. There has to be some mechanism by which this operates.
Yeah, and in fact, there's like a trap that we fall into because it's sort of like, oh, well, no, you just have to believe enough. And then that's where we can see legitimate psychopathy being fostered, because it's like I'm just not believing enough. I have to really believe it and really just fully commit to walking off this cliff or off this bridge or whatever. And then it'll actually, happen that way.
And so Crowley has several definitions of magic. One of them is to do with appropriate force, right? The science and art of causing change to occur in conformity with will. Will is not a brute force thing. It's about delicately managing these specific forces. Another one more explicitly has to do with spirits, where magic is causing change to occur by the intercession of occult forces or something like that. So then there's a mechanism, right? Like in the Matrix, they don't just magically start manipulating time and space. They go in through these ports, and they have operators who are sort of editing the surface code and creating these little pockets of space where they can operate in a sort of unusual way. And so you're right to notice this I and my Father are one thing, because it gives some kind of oblique reference to some sort of a mechanism where if I'm now it's not just about realizing that the world doesn't exist, not just having this awareness of Maya, but being in the correct relationship with the Creator, so that I can become a co-creator.
Well, here's the double entendre part. We're also looking at the John Barleycorn concept.
Say more about that.
I want to say as little as possible, because I and my Father are one, and relating that to the John Barleycorn concept might be fruit for meditation. And I just kind of want to be a dick and not delve into it further than that for the time being. But let's see if it manifests anywhere else in the discussion, because I've already derailed things enough.
Yeah, well, we should read that song at some point.
Yeah. Do you want to look that up now and read it into the record?
Sure. So what it is an old English folk song about beer. There were 3 men came from the west, their fortunes for to tell, and the life of John Barleycorn as well. They laid him in 3 furrows deep, laid clods upon his head. Then these 3 men made a solemn vow John Barleycorn was dead. Fa-la-la, it's a lucky day, sing fa-la-leo, fa-la-la. It's a lucky day, sing fa-la-la-leo. Let him die for a long, long time till the rain from heaven fell. Then little Sir John sprang up his head and did amaze them all. They let him stand till midsummer's day, till he took both pale and wane. The little Sir John, he grew a long beard, and so became a little bit of poetic license here because I don't actually speak Middle English. I'm going to say so became a man, but it's man. Till he looketh both pale and wane, little Sir John grew a long beard, and so became a man. They have hired men with scythes so sharp to cut him off at the knee. They rolled him and they tied him around the waist, and they severed him barbarously. They have hired men with crab-tree sticks to cut him skin from bone, and the miller has served him worse than that, for he's ground him 'tween two stones. They've wheeled him there, they've wheeled him there, they've wheeled him to a barn, and they have served him worse than that, they've bunged him in a vat. They have worked their will on John Barleycorn, but have lived to tell the tale, for they pour him out of an old brown jug, and they can call him home-brewed ale. So it's the story of the death, resurrection, torture, and reaping, and fermentation of literal barleycorn into beer, and anthropomorphizing the corn as a visitor from far away, because it's fun to bully people, and so we just imagine we're beating this guy up. It's supposed to be like a little bit funny,
And he's also dead. So is it the same John Barleycorn, or is it a different John Barleycorn,
Yeah, and so the idea here would be that, like, this is obviously not a person. This is a harvest and reaping of the harvest, and then alchemizing this harvest into a substance that is not that healthy. It's beer drinking, like it's not regular nourishment, but it's like spiritual food. It alchemizes it does something to your soul, to your mentality, to your behavior. It brings joy and detachment and certain other kind of
sweet wines and wines that foam,
and liberty makes you react more naturally, maybe in situations. So the idea of talking about Jesus as John Barleycorn is of connecting him to, like we say, these fertility myths, and emphasizing the mythology of the text over any kind of literal reading.
Well, there's a transmutation. Basically, we could sum it up as a transmutation. And there's a really beautiful one. My very next quote that I had pulled was from the section on the miracle of Cana, which I'll read through real quick, just because it's relevant to the stream of thought right now. Dionysus reappears. The first miracle done by Jesus was the turning of water into wine, which is exactly what Dionysus does. The vine is the alchemist that transmutes the rain of heaven into the juice of the grape. Even that line is like, the vine is the alchemist that transmutes the rain of heaven into the juice of the grape. And Jesus said, I am the vine. John writes, this beginning of miracles did Jesus in Cana of Galilee, and manifested forth his glory, and his disciples believed on him. Crowley says, it is certainly an excellent reason. Now in John's Gospel, which is in many ways the best for our purpose, save that there is no mention of the virgin birth, this miracle is immediately followed by the cleansing of the temple, and this is where he's sort of going into the ceremonial aspects, the different portions of ritual.
Do you want to talk a little bit about this relationship between Dionysus and Jesus, maybe, since you've read that section of that? Because the next little piece to talk about is the third Jesus. We've got Jesus the yogi, Jesus the Jewish prophet, and we've got Jesus as the typical god of Asia.
Yeah.
And there's this long story about the evolution of Asian gods, from beings that receive sacrifices. First the sacrifice of corn, then the sacrifice of kings, then the sacrifice of mock kings, then the sacrifice of the children of kings, then the sacrifice of children at all. And so Jesus fits in to this narrative as being like the sacrifice of a mock king.
Yeah.
And I've talked about this before a little bit, because I got really into the Indo-European mythology stuff for about 10 minutes. And so the first story, the first creation myth that's been reconstructed based on, chasing the line of of Indo-European creation myths back through history, and then we imagine that this might have been something like the first story, has these twins who exist before the cosmos, and they're walking with a cow, and then Manus, the first man, kills Yimo, the first twin, and then makes the universe out of Yimo's body because they agree to do this. It's not a murder. It's like hey, we're bored, we're alone, let's make the cosmos.
Yeah.
But the idea is that because Manus makes the first sacrifice, Manus is the first priest, and then because Yimo is the first sacrifice, then Yimo is the first king. And this is like the crown is in the kingdom as the kingdom in the crown, but after another manner. So like Yimo was the first king, he was sacrificed, he made the whole world, and then now there are kings over the whole world, which is the first king. And then subsequently we sacrifice bulls instead of people because that, and the sacrificing the bulls, each year we sacrifice a bull and it reinvigorates creation. We don't need to sacrifice humans anymore because we've already sacrificed humans. And we see all sorts of stories about this again and again and again, right? Like, in the Exodus, there's the firstborn of Egypt slain, and then subsequently on the feast for the for the Passover, we sacrifice lambs and goats and bullocks. We're sacrificing animals so that we don't have to sacrifice.
It's fascinating, yeah, because we
children.
have a long portion of pull quotes from J.G. Frazer's The Golden Bough that you're referring to here that's sort of going through this process. And it's really fascinating to look at it from this perspective because it's like you can picture where, ancient peoples trying to survive and depending on the harvest and that sort of thing. And then if you have bad years, you're trying to reason out why. And it's like you could see where, like, you could imagine where a mythos is created where the gods needed their share. So they took their share since we didn't allot something for them. So we need to allot something for them so that the next one will actually have enough for us as well. And then, from there, it's like creating this stigma of like, well, firstborn, maybe it's even something to do with, the high death rate, the high child death rate and that sort of thing. Maybe it's tied to that as well, where it's like, well, in order to, keep some of them alive, some of them have to die. Maybe that's the gods taking theirs anyway. So if we specifically go out of our way to sacrifice the firstborn, maybe that's tied up into it. But either way, yeah, this evolution of the thing, like God initially getting Abraham to kill his son Isaac and then staying his hand, and then the sacrifice of a ram caught in the thistle bush being enough.
Yeah, another great example, right? Don't sacrifice children, sacrifice animals. And then Jesus, what the story of Jesus does is it gives Jews a way to practice now that the temple has been destroyed. In 70 AD, the temple will be demolished. Many of our early of the Gospels talk about the demolishment of the temple as if they're predicting it, which is how we know they were written after 70 AD because they predict the destruction of the temple, which already happened, which had to have already happened by then. And so when the story of the Passover, when Jesus says, this is my body, this is my blood, this is the sacrament, this is the sacrifice, because there's no place to sacrifice the animals anymore. The temple's been destroyed, so there's no place. Judaism doesn't have, it has little synagogues and stuff, but it doesn't have temple after temple after temple the way Christians have church after church after church. There was only one temple, one place to do the sacrifice. And with that gone, there needed to be an alternative. So now we can just sacrifice bread and wine as the body and blood of Christ so that we don't have to sacrifice the animals at the temple that no longer exists.
Yeah.
So it's this way of constantly updating and refining the sacrifice, which should be, mythologically, all the way back to the beginning, should be the king. But no, we use bulls instead of kings, or we use animals instead of children, or we use just the body and blood of Christ instead of sacrificing an actual animal. The sacrifice is always of the king, but it can be of the king by proxy through a number of various other avenues.
I'd just like to get meta for a moment and point out the fact that even this line of reasoning is inferring a lot. It's similar but not the same thing as inferring that Jesus must have gone off and seen a guru during that period that's lost. The period's lost, but our brains want to find a way to connect things up and make sense out of them. And this is doing the job for us right now, looking at these anthropomorphical kinds of ideas and the thinking of things in terms of this evolution. It makes us, I feel like this makes a lot of sense, and it's very satisfying and interesting to explore these ideas. But we're doing the same process to some extent, right?
Sure. I mean, I think you have to draw some conclusions, and some conclusions fit the evidence better than other conclusions.
Yeah. So, and the reason I say this is not to completely deflate it, because it's another one of those things. Just because we've if we become aware of it, doesn't discredit it entirely. It just means it doesn't mean we have to fight that and go against it or something like that. But it is doing a job, and if we become self-aware of what that job is, then we can put it into context a little better. Hopefully, I think.
Okay. There's a couple of places where in the Crowley corpus where Crowley will mention the blood libel, which is this wacky conspiracy theory about Jews drinking the blood of Christian children, and it's bad news. It's gross and it's off base, and so once you become aware of that, and you notice other, maybe you're looking in here and thinking about how Jews are, there's talk about child sacrifice and stuff in here, you might be kind of worried about that, right? Is this anti-Semitic rant he's on? Maybe partly. But it's also in context, with the Frazer, part of the story of the Frazer, part of the story of even what even modern people are talking about with, the Indo-European myth being to do with sacrifices reinvigorating the world. And all the way up into the 70s, it was accepted that child sacrifice was happening in Carthage, for example, with the Carthaginians being a off-branch of Phoenicians who are an off-branch of Canaanites, and then the Hebrew Bible frames the Canaanites as being like a heretical Jewish sect, but it's actually more like that Jews are a spin-off of the Canaanite people. The Canaanites predated, and then somehow the Jews separate themselves out from the Canaanites. And I think it's now believed again that large-scale child sacrifice really was happening, at least in Carthage. Moloch sacrifice, burnt offerings. And so my sort of conspiracy theory brain puts this together as Judaism spins off from the Canaanite religion and then has such bad feelings about Canaanites, such that large tracts of the Torah and the prophets and stuff are just complaining about how awful Canaanites are. I think that maybe a big part of the Jewish heresy against mainstream Canaanitism is that Jews were anti-child sacrifice, and that the Canaanites were doing this practice, and that some segment of that population decided it was gross and separated themselves off and would rather become nomads than continue sacrificing their children. And so what you said earlier about infant mortality rate is not just, that's not just you yapping. There's theories about that, right?
Yeah.
So God's going to take some percentage of the children anyway. So if we sacrifice our firstborn, maybe our next 7 will survive.
That. Yeah.
And so one paper I was reading said that maybe this gives us a clue to why Carthage was founded at all. Maybe mainstream Phoenician society was turning away from child sacrifice as a large scale practice, and there were some segment of the population that wanted to hang on to it as being part of their religious tradition. So they went up to Carthage and founded that city specifically as a place where we could keep doing these Molochs, burning Molochs to Baal, or Belial, and then the Greeks came over and sowed salt into the ground because they were so disgusted by it. It was weird. The paper said two things. The paper said maybe the city was founded as a place to do that because everyone else thought it was disgusting, so they needed their own state. But they also said, oh, it was a different time and infant mortality rates were so high that and the Greeks who were against child sacrifice, they just thought it was kind of gross. They didn't have strong moral opinions about it. So either they did or they didn't, right? It's not the case that it was benign and also so radically taboo that you had to found your own state in order to keep up the practice.
Well,
but
it's you could conceive of this as being something that at one stage of the game, because I don't think it's cut and dry as that anyway. Even
we're
if
all just, we're just spitballing, right?
Yeah,
it's just something that's coming back into the academic discourses about 2012. But the point is, this is a real thing that actually happened and is part of our shared history, antiquity, and that we need to be able to talk about it without being worried about it's not part of this other anti-Semitic conspiracy, conspiracy theory, which it's no less problematic, but it's a thing that really happened as opposed to being an accusation.
Yeah, and that's not. I don't want to get derailed by that kind of nonsense anyway, because that's just masturbatory as far as I'm concerned right now. We're discussing this as speculating on ways to conceive of the evolution of these ideas. And you could see where at one stage of the game things are really rough and it's more difficult and it makes more sense to be making these sacrifices because it seems to actually tie into your survival. So it's legitimately tied into that. Then at later times when things are much easier, more structured and safer, you start wondering, why the hell are we doing these horrible things? Maybe we should try and create change in some way, and finding ways to appease the superstitious side, the paranoid side, and just deal with the masses who might be more disinclined to change the old ways of doing things. Whatever the case may be, you can see that over time things are going to change, and trying to find ways to make that amenable to the culture that we're in question, so being able to sort of say, well, we're going to sacrifice these animals and that's going to do the job for us, or whatever the case may be.
Yeah, there's I think it's I'm going to say, I think I'm trying to remember, I have it written down.
Yeah.
Exodus 22:29, the Jews have exodused and they're wandering in the wilderness, and at some point maybe they've made some trespass or something, and God's telling them how to amend for their trespass.
Yeah.
And it's your firstborn sons you shall give to me, some percentage of your harvest. Also in the same manner, the firstborn of all your cattle and the firstborn of all your sheep, or something like that. 7 days they'll be with their moms, and on the 8th day they'll be brought to me. And
we don't generally see that in a strong, thriving society where there's no threat of.
Well, what this is usually interpreted as being the firstborn son of every family needs to become a priest. But it's talking about food. The first two sentences are about corn and wheat, and then give me your firstborn sons, and then in the same manner give me your firstborn cows and your firstborn sheep.
Yeah.
They're not asking the cows and sheep to go be priests.
Yeah, exactly.
So one theory I've heard about this is that it's a penalty because the Jews are constantly wandering off and losing their faith and, worshiping other gods that aren't the one God. And so maybe they're saying okay, if you want to worship, Baal demands child sacrifices. So why, you want to start doing child sacrifices? Come on, fuck off. And my interpretation is just that it's because all these texts are sort of composite texts from various traditions and that this is a bubbling up of an old, an old piece of something sacred, that to maybe the people who included it actually did mean your firstborn son should be priest, but more traditionally maybe meant something about child sacrifice. So so Crowley talks about it in several places here, and he's not as out of line as he sounds like he is at first. But he says the most important thing here is the continuity from Dionysus to Jesus. So what you were going to talk about that, and I went on a 20
Well, you
minute
asked me to
tangent.
talk about that, but I'm not sure that I'm qualified to exactly. But why don't you, since you brought it up? Because it feels like...
Well, because you were already there. You read the quotation and stuff.
Yeah, but it seemed like you had a thought in mind specifically to bring that together.
My thought was Crowley says it's most important. So
Because Dionysus is sort of the god of wine, woman, and song, so to speak, and has a lot of parallels to Jesus coming to town on an ass, and he's surrounded by his followers who are all, in this case, women. But I don't know the myth well enough from the actual texts and stuff to be able to,
No, I only know what Crowley says about it, and I don't. There's a weird thing that happens when Christianity conquers the world, is that many traditional faiths sort of adopt the shape of Christianity because they think
a very
that's
Roman thing.
What an authentic religion looks like. And so you have all these pictures of like the Hindu Trinity with like maybe Shiva and Durga and baby Ganesh. And it's like Joseph, Mary, and Jesus.
Yeah.
But that's not like that. I think in antiquity, those would not have existed. It's just a way that religions come to shape themselves into a more Christian shape.
Yeah.
Because that's what's to try to claim some authenticity or something.
Oh, you know
like
what?
that.
I apologize for interjecting this at a random point, but you just mentioned Joseph, and that made me think. You know what's interesting about the very beginning of Matthew, the book of the Gospel according to Matthew?
Love to hear it.
He starts it off with the genealogy of starting from Abraham, I guess it is, and working his way up to Joseph, and sort of pointing out that it's like 14 generations to Babylon, 14 generations, or what is it, 14 generations to David, and then 14 generations to Babylon, and then 14 generations to Jesus. So he gets it all the way up to Joseph, and then Jesus isn't even connected to Joseph anyway because he's a virgin birth.
That's right. Joseph is not the father.
So, yeah. So it's like, okay, all right.
Channeling Oprah Winfrey, or Geraldo Rivera there a little bit.
But yeah, it's kind of funny just to
You are not the father.
or is that Maury Povich?
Is that Maury Povich? Yeah. Yeah.
Anyway.
That is weird. But so the things that Crowley says about Dionysus is that he's hidden from Hera by being stitched into his thigh.
into Zeus's thigh?
Zeus's thigh, yeah. And thigh is given in quotes, like, as they say in the ancient world. So I don't know. I know Crowley. I don't know what he means by that, but I assume he means that Dionysus was stuffed up Zeus's ass. And then he says, Egypt, in the ancient writings, almost always means darkness. So I guess because Kemet is the black land or something. I don't know why he says that. That does seem specious to me, but for Crowley, Egypt always means darkness.
I guess it's the association with...
So Jesus was stuffed up the ass of the world, I guess, by being sent to Egypt. And he says Zeus is hiding Dionysus from Hera, which sounds spookily similar to Herod. Mm-hmm. And so that's... these are all just sort of like sound-alike fallacies. Yeah. But so Jesus is up the ass of the world, Dionysus is up Zeus's ass, and finally they're both kind of reborn when the danger has passed.
Maybe thigh is metaphorical for phallus.
Oh.
That might be... that might produce more fun stuff than ass. But just throwing it out there.
Stitched into his phallus.
Yeah.
I don't want that. I don't want that. And then there's palm leaf things, there's water to wine, there's wine things. Crowley says turns water into wine, which is exactly what Dionysus does. I don't think he means any miracle story about turning water into wine and loaves into fishes. I think he means that grapes are nourished by the sun, the earth, and the water, and that you then take grapes and make wine.
So it's that transmutation aspect again.
So he's pointing to a mythological story that represents a material process.
You know what? One thing from just having read through Matthew and taken notes and having it fresh in my mind as well is that there's a few places where it emphasizes the Pharisees, for instance, criticizing Jesus and his followers for eating. Whereas they're all fasting and all this sort of thing, and they're eating and drinking, and it's funny to think of like Jesus and his followers as all eating and drinking and that sort of thing. That seems pretty on the nose for the Dionysus thing too.
The revelry, yeah. One more kind of point of interest to note here, just before we leave this section. Crowley says, one has only to read the prophets to be bored stiff with their eternal diatribes against all these practices. He means the practice of child sacrifice. Most of them talk of nothing else. One cannot quote them. One would have to reprint them entirely, right? like there's no one section where the prophets are against child sacrifice. That's all they ever talk about. So you just read any quote from the prophets and they'll be talking about how child sacrifice is bad. So like the early Israelites are obsessed with this problem and trying to solve it. So and I guess the implication is they wouldn't have to talk about it so much if it weren't happening. Yeah. So but this is the kind of part of the reason to read this was to talk about the theory of the golden bough, and the golden bough is how this stories of the sacrifice of kings move through through different sort of layers of sacrifice, different sort of sub sacrifices, so that you don't actually have to kill your king, and how this this tale kind of evolves over time, and possibly that tale is reflective of how practices also evolve over time.
Yeah.
And then how the Jesus myth is a participant in this kind of movement of archetypal stories from prehistory all the way up to the present.
There's anecdotal stuff given of like sort of, for instance, a prisoner being taken and given all the royal raiment and being allowed to do whatever he wants for the night, and being treated like the king and properly purified and consecrated and all that sort of thing. And then the following morning being stripped and all that sort of thing, and killed in sacrifice. So,
and Crowley's going to make a lot about this when it comes to talking about the Feast of the Passover, right? Like how some versions, the Feast of the Passover is about Jesus teaching his disciples how to do the Eucharist. Drink this as my blood, eat this as my body. But some versions omit all that, and they have like this perfectly beautiful feast, and then instead Jesus like dips some bread in gravy and says like, whoever I give this to has to betray me to the enemy, and then gives it to it to Judas, and Judas immediately walks out and betrays him to the enemy. So like this story of the party of the Last Supper is the celebration of the mock king before the sacrifice.
Yeah.
So let's move on and talk about the greater and lesser mysteries. Now it begins to talk about the gospel stories as a template for initiation rituals. And it's unclear to me whether Crowley means that this is a template for initiation rituals, or whether he seems to be implying that this is a fictional story taken from templates for initiation rituals that already existed and given as an allegory for how to conduct deliberately given as a deliberate allegory for how one should conduct initiations.
Yeah.
And there are some things here that I harmonize with my understanding, like death and resurrection being the climax of a sort of lesser mystery cycle. Okay, I get it. The purifications and consecrations. Okay, like the baptism is part of mystery cycles, or like baptism is part of that of most initiation rituals. But there's little things like the three hailings, which I don't know what that means. And, well, here, let's see. The baptism, the first hailing, the second hailing, the third hailing, the making of wine, the scourging, and the prophecy of death. Those are the lesser mysteries.
Yeah.
And then the greater mystery, rather than being something that happens after death, we zoom in on those last 7 days and have echoes of all the first... The first 33 years repeating themselves in those 7 days, but in a more refined way. So instead of being baptized with water by John the Baptist, he's anointed with oil by the Magdalena, by this person named Mary, who we don't know who it is. It could be Mary, or it could be Mary, or it could be Martha, or it could be one of the hookers.
Yeah.
But I don't know how much you feel comfortable talking about it. I think you might actually have to be a little further along than you, but is this like the Masonic template? Like, what is this that's happening here?
I mean, it does sound like his biggest emphasis is the ceremonial nature of these things. So there's specifically those points. The hailings are kind of like the points in the gospel where somebody acknowledges Jesus. So it's like that's like a ceremonial act to acknowledge, I think. So that's what that's sort of telling me. And it's doing it, happening at particular stages and that sort of thing. Again, it's kind of like the structure of the narrative is not as historical as it is ceremonial in this estimation.
I can sort of imagine maybe some places in rituals I've been through where there've been like little mini conversations off to the sides in certain places, but like I don't remember ever seeing like a subheading in any of my initiation scripts that said like the first hailing, the second hailing. I don't quite know.
No, that's
if he's saying
that
this is the
particular wording?
template of initiation, what does it mean?
Well, that's the thing. I think it's like, keep in mind the context might be different as well. I don't know that it's like literally going, this is what you're dealing with when you're in this particular initiation. Because, if that's the case, then all the initiations he's talking about are modeled after the life of Christ, Like that's the biggest template for Western, mystery schools and stuff like that in the modern age as compared to something that would have been around at that time constructed. So it's modeled after that, then of course it's not going to have, it'll probably be following those steps and that sort of thing. But I think it's like, in this case, in the context of the Gospels, it's like, this is the king mythos, that where it's like, this is hailing as acknowledging him as the king. When you're getting initiated, you're not being acknowledged as the king, That's a bit of a different context. So
Yeah, so then how is this an initiation to ritual template? It just all seems a little bit loosey-goosey to me.
Well, that's the thing. I
Like,
think you're trying to snap it into place in a one-to-one relationship, but I think the thing is, it's like he's using hailing. I could be totally wrong. It could be totally like a Masonic thing where there's literally a hailing going on, and there probably is. But it's like, I do think it's like he's emphasizing the stages of a ritual. For instance, like when he was talking about he's relating somebody with a water jug to Aquarius, giving like astrological equivalences and that sort of thing as well. I think there's a certain level of, why is this included that he comes to such and such a town and such a person says, "Hail, you are the king of Israel," and that sort of thing. That seems pretty ceremonial. Doesn't seem, like worth including in a historical document necessarily, right?
I just, so this is one of the things that made this so difficult for me to read. As Crowley goes, the language is not that complicated. He's not distracted by telling jokes all over the place. Like it's pretty comprehensible, but I kept getting distracted by like the desire to fact check all of his arguments. Like if the goal is to convince me that the Jesus story is a mythological story that's being reframed by a particular teller for a particular time and place, you're like, okay, this is a story that's always been told. It's just some of the details have been modified now to appeal to a particular set of people. And the best you can do is say, like, doesn't Hera sound like Herod? And Dionysus was hidden in his father's thigh, just like Jesus was hidden in Egypt. I don't see any harmony between those events at all. Like I don't think being stitched into someone else's body is the same thing as moving a couple of states over. And so here again, he's like I could take any story in the world and build an initiation ritual based on the, or based on, or like every movie in the world. You can break it down into a 3-act structure. That doesn't mean they're all the same movie. Like it just seems it seems like totally arbitrary, unless he's comparing it to something else that exists that he thinks pre-existed. Because it is true that the Gospels are very popular and that many initiation rituals could be written on the Gospel template. For him to say that this is like, that the life of Jesus is, as it comes down to us, was inspired by initiation rituals. He has to be pointing to specific initiation rituals that pre-existed the writing of the Gospels. And I have no way of evaluating that claim, and I suspect he doesn't either.
Well, again, that's what I mean. It's like if you're looking at modern initiation rituals, that's a different context than ancient Roman practices,
So
like where you have
he
like
can't say this is just like the rites of Eleusis because they don't exist.
but they
no
do
way to
have.
compare them.
I mean, he references like there's like a ritual of having, what is it? It's like having young people running through the town and having people whipping them and stuff, and there's like that sort of thing. So there are ceremonial or ritualistic practices that are going on that do have correspondences and that sort of thing. But yeah, like I say, I'm not, that's obviously I'm not giving anything particularly convincing, but to your point here, but I do think that really what he's doing is not necessarily saying that the rituals that we undergo today are literally using all these steps. Then again, I might be wrong about that.
So for Crowley, the lesser mystery and the greater mystery are the knowledge and conversation of the Holy Guardian Angel and the crossing of the abyss. I think. How do you feel about that?
I would say I'd be careful about that one, just because
outer order and inner order.
It's a different context. I don't know if that's the same context. I think he's talking about the lesser mysteries and the greater mysteries of Christianity, of the Gospels, of the life of Christ. Like, am I mistaken? Are you referring to something specific that I might not be thinking of?
Well, I was just going to say that it was interesting when we discovered that by reading Liber Samech, that the knowledge and conversation of the Holy Guardian Angel is also framed as a death and resurrection. Like we knew the crossing of the abyss was a death and resurrection. And here, both the lesser mystery and the greater mystery go towards the crucifixion.
Yeah.
Neither of them include or transcend the crucifixion. They both head to that point and then stop.
Yeah.
So I thought that was an interesting
and that's why I wouldn't think
notice.
that the crossing of the abyss would be really involved. But I think that a lot of the stuff that we talk about within Thelema, including, basically it all comes to a death and resurrection of some sort. Like the rosy cross, the idea of samadhi, these different ideas, initiation itself. There's death and resurrection involved. So yeah, I think that's actually. It's a good analogy for Liber Samech, but I don't know that crossing the abyss necessarily comes into play here.
Okay. Here's what he says about this structure. To anyone acquainted with ritual, there is a formal feeling about this. Baptism, first healing, second healing, hailing, making of wine, scourging, prophecy of death. It was usual in the ancient mysteries to have a sort of prologue, which played the drama in petio, as it were, to prepare the mind of the candidate for the real thing, or the mysteries were played beneath a deeper veil for the postulants of lesser grades. The high-grade Masons will note that the third degree is a veil for the 18th and the 18th for the 30th. Now, if we were to find these same stage directions, as we may now call them, repeated on a larger scale, it would confirm our view mightily. I particularly beg the reader to observe the crowding of these symbolic incidents together, beginning a few days before the Passover and ending at that date, and note well that nothing of its kind takes place for all the whole gospel until the Passover is at hand, and in chapter 12. In the interval, Jesus is the conventional worker of miracles, the dispenser of discourses. There is nothing in any way to suggest ceremonial, but the events of it at the end of his life are crowded into just a few days, just like those which we have considered above. So I'm misunderstanding the argument a little bit here. So the point is that we take these elements that maybe seem vaguely ceremonial, that have, at least to Crowley, maybe not to me, but to Crowley, have the vibe of something that feels like something that would happen in a ceremonial ritual, and then if they're repeated in microcosm later on, or properly like in macrocosm, that this is like the prologue to the initiation, and then the greater, what he calls the greater mysteries, are going to be the initiation proper, that if we can find those two resonant echoes, that's a clue that there might be something more sort of ceremonial going on.
And in that light, again, I think it's like
no way of evaluating this claim, but
a better analogy might be the neophyte ritual followed by the knowledge and conversation. You know what I mean? Having that as like doing it in small form, and then having this death and resurrection kind of in small form, and then leading, like preparing you for this greater sort of event to come.
And so the greater mystery, we have anointing, proclamation, Last Supper, scourging, and man, he talks a lot about the scourging.
Yeah, isn't that where we get all those J.G. Frazer quotes and whatnot?
Is that where it starts to come in? So if you want to do that, let's do lots of that.
So the first one I got is, the one thing that looms clear through the haze of this weird tradition is the memory of a great massacre of firstborn. This was the origin, we are told, both of the sanctity of the firstborn and of the feast of the Passover. But when we are further told that the people whose firstborn were slaughtered on that occasion were not the Hebrews but their enemies, we are at once met by serious difficulties. Why, may we ask? So this is like, I guess, talking about the Egyptians. So the Hebrews would put the blood of lambs or whatever on their doors steps so that it would prevent the angel of death from coming on them, and instead the angel of death would kill all the firstborns of the Egyptians. Why, we may ask, should the Israelites kill the firstlings of their cattle forever because God once killed those of the Egyptians? And why should every Hebrew father have to pay God a ransom for his firstborn child because God once slew all the firstborn children of the Egyptians? In this form, the tradition offers no intelligible explanation of the custom, but it at once becomes clear and intelligible when we assume that in the original version of the story, it was the Hebrew firstborn that were slain. That in fact, the slaughter of the firstborn children was formally what the slaughter of the firstborn cattle always continued to be, not an isolated butchery, but a regular custom, which with the growth of more humane sentiments was afterwards softened into the vicarious sacrifice of a lamb and the payment of a ransom for each child. So it's pretty much on the nose with what I was suggesting.
Yeah, so people reading this might be wondering, what do you mean the Israels have to sacrifice the firstborn? That's not part of the tradition, but I think Crowley has the same reading of Exodus 22:29 that I do, that it is a command by God to...
This is Frazer here. That's,
that it is a command by God to sacrifice, the first, give me your firstborn sons 8 days after, whatever. Mm-hmm. So, and then, so he thinks there's some older version of the Passover story where rather than being a plague on Egypt, that the children of Israel are sacrificing their children for in order to be set free or something, and then they have to continue to pay for that sacrifice for forever. I think that's a bit weird. I feel like the harmony of the story is so much nicer when you have Moses escaping an edict. Oh, these Jews are out of control. Pharaoh just commands, let's kill the firstborn son of each Jewish household to just reduce their numbers. And then Moses escapes that by being dropped into a river, and then 30 years later, the God of Israel repays that debt by making the final plague the death of the firstborn of every son of Egypt. And then the ledger is even. But let's say you do have to pay your debts. It's like, I once killed the firstborn of every son of Egypt, and now you repay me by giving me your children. That's it. I wouldn't say like, oh, in order to escape from Egypt, give me all your firstborn sons, and then I'll fix it so you can escape from Egypt. And then, by the way, keep doing that forever. It's like a protection racket.
Well, that's the problem. I don't think it rationally, all kind of ties up into a nice bow or anything like that. It does feel like a lot of this stuff kind of evolved over time and is put together in a mythology after the fact, which is what the argument is for the life of Jesus as well in this case. The next paragraph from Frazer reads, putting the two traditions together. Oh, I skipped one. Sorry. This is actually, it does have the thing. Here the reader may be reminded of another Hebrew tradition in which the sacrifice of the firstborn child is indicated still more clearly. Abraham, we are informed, was commanded by God to offer up his firstborn son, Isaac, as a burnt sacrifice. And as was on the point of obeying the divine command, when God, content with this proof of his faith and obedience, substituted for the human victim a ram, which Abraham accordingly sacrificed instead of his son. Putting the two traditions together and observing how exactly they dovetail into each other and into the later Hebrew practice of actually sacrificing the firstborn children by fire to Baal or Moloch, we can hardly resist the conclusion that before the practice of redeeming them was introduced, the Hebrews, like the other branches of the Semitic race, regularly sacrificed their firstborn children by the fire or the knife. The Passover, if this view is right, was the occasion when the awful sacrifice was offered, and the tradition of its origin has preserved in its main outlines a vivid memory of the horrors of these frightful nights.
So importantly, Frazer is talking about a mythological history, a history of the evolution of the way this story of the sacrifice of kings is told. But he also believes that those stories are told because of the way they connect to culture. And that if we're telling stories about the sacrifice of children, the sacrifice of kings, the sacrifice of princes, any kind of human or animal sacrifice, probably the reason those stories are being told is that they resonate with an audience that's actually practicing these things. For most of human history, or like for most of history, I should say, Moloch has been thought of as a god who receives sacrifices. I think we now understand that Moloch means burnt offering. And that the sacrifices in Carthage would have been to Baal, who is a storm god who was a son of El. And then when Yod-Heh-Vav-Heh came and was introduced to the Canaanite pantheon from wherever in the wilderness he came from, he was a direct competitor of Baal, which is why those two gods hate each other in the Old Testament. Because they're both gods that existed, but that are both kind of like the Thor figure. They're both storm deities, thunder heroes, and so the Moloch sacrifices would have been to Baal. There's some question about whether or not the Moloch sacrifices would have ever been offered to Yod-Heh-Vav-Heh as well. But this is one of the reasons Moses gets so upset when he sees the golden calf, maybe, because Greek historians talk about the sacrifice in Carthage as being like a brazen bull. Like you have this hollow bronze bowl and you stuff it with meat and then you put it in the fire and then just bake living children over a fire. And so it's possible that the golden calf of Exodus, that after worshiping Egyptian gods for a generation, they're finally free and get to start worshiping their own gods. And Moses says, like, "Oh,
get the kids."
And Moses is like, "Hey, Aheya, Asar, Aheya, this is great. I have the law." And they're like, no, Bough. And they start working on giving their firstborn on the 8th day. And Moses is like, no.
Yeah.
That's the important part, possibly, of the 10 Commandments.
So much of the Old Testament reads very much like that, where it's reprimanding the people for not listening to the words of God and that sort of thing. But it all reads very much like after the fact, like, oh, shit started going really badly, and we can attribute it to not listening to God, or we started doing the wrong thing over here and that sort of thing. So it's a lot of superstition and a lot of that's the way it reads to me, a lot of OCD.
Yeah.
I mean, I guess I'm going to just get Crowley's, sort of seems to give his thesis here. He says, this thesis being accepted, we may formulate it thus. Jesus was the most popular of the holy men of Syria of his time, and his sayings were already being collected by a scribe. In the case of John's gospel, we have another holy man, this time of the Essene persuasion. There is also what is, to my mind, a very minor portrait in the group, that of the Orthodox Jew, who wished merely to restore the strict law of Moses, or even to tighten its bonds. This is compatible either with the Yogi or with the Essene. Finally, there is the attempt to identify Jesus with the Messiah, which has no basis in any of the stories recorded of the sayings or doings of Jesus. So that sort of like ties together the various threads here.
Yeah, so here it is permissible, however, to call attention to several very astonishing facts. The entire symbolism of the Jesus who died and rose again is astrological and mystic in its minutest points. The incident of the anointing, which is a regular part of any ritual, like the ceremonial purification elsewhere recorded. The man bearing the pitcher of water, Luke 22:10, which suggests the zodiacal sign of Aquarius. The command of Jesus, Luke 22, 36 to 38, to furnish swords which were not to be used. However, Luke 22:50 to 51, the ceremonial robings and crownings and scourgings, all these things suggest a drama, not a history, a symbolic representation of John Barleycorn, not at all the record of what happened to any one man, but what happens to all men. In the mere facts of the nativity at winter solstice and the crucifixion at the equinox of spring suggest the birth and the year and the elevation of the sun above the equator, which pictorially is represented exactly this way long before the time of Pilate. Anyway, so he says the whole symbolism is zodiacal, but only gives one example of a zodiacal sign that appears in the gospel. This is another thing that people talk about today, and there's a very good creator called Krakenford on YouTube who talks about the oldest stories that we know existed, including Proto-Indo-European stories, but also stories from prehistoric Americas and Africa, as in China. And he often talks about stories in terms of their expressions of zodiacal sort of imagery, that like for example, the story of the Great Hunt is a story of looking up at the stars and explaining the movement of the constellations or the planets through the constellations by this sort of loose narrative. And again, the zeitgeist crowd will often say "Son of God," S-O-N, "Son of God," S-U-N, which is a joke that only works in English, which is a language that is not very old. But all these sorts of threads, they're still being pulled by the conspiracy set, by the alt history set today, and then this idea that the birth and death of Jesus are like a festival of the spring equinox and a festival of the winter solstice, and that Catholics were going around bogarting all the pagan festivals and just rebranding them as Christian festivals, or stealing gods and putting saints' names on them and giving them the same powers. So that, like, for example, one that I heard was Isis was the mother of Horus, you may worship Horus, but you pray to Isis because she listens better and acts faster. And so, just like Mary listens better and acts faster. This is all stuff that I was taught in high school by a very offbeat classics professor. And I don't know to what degree it's considered to be true. Like, I don't exactly think that this stuff is all correct. One of my sort of YouTube sources says the reason obviously the reason the death of Jesus happens at the spring equinox is that it canonically happens, within 3 days of the Passover.
Yeah.
And so that's just when that takes place. And then if you're going to make up a date for the death of Jesus, if you don't know someone's birthday, it's tradition to put it 9 months out from their death day, so that the date of their conception would have been the same day as their death, and so their birth has to be 9 months removed. Now, I think in the case of Jesus, it's actually removed in the wrong direction, because if you were conceived at Christmas, you wouldn't be born. You'd be born when my son was born in September, not in. So that's a little bit, that kind of fails a little bit. But I think most people do not think that the Christmas festival is just Catholics stealing Saturnalia. I think it's thought to be a coincidence or something. I mean, it's kind of an interesting thing, because it's like we also have like Mexico is a great example of seeing the mother goddess and that sort of thing, finding veneration even within Catholicism. No, hold on, my math is all wrong. If you're conceived on your death day, then he would have been conceived at Easter. And Christmas is 9 months removed from Easter. So that makes sense. I was thinking.
Yeah. You got that. Yeah. I also like that idea of like being conceived on your death day, because it again carries over that John Barleycorn kind of conception of death being a birth as well.
That's supposedly the tradition. If you don't have the dates for someone, you just imagine their birthday being removed by that many months from their death.
I didn't know that.
So that's why Christmas happens about that time. But the fact that there are other festivals, it's not just like, hey, we're going to steal the most popular gambling festival and put our stamp on it. It's like things get naturally syncretized.
Yeah. Well, it's there's something to be said for the way in which the Roman Empire adopted Christianity and then had to basically converted everyone to Christianity gradually over time, so that you could imagine where it would make sense that like converting these traditional festivals to Christian ones. So it's definitely a seductive concept in that sense, because it makes sense. Like, I mean, Crowley actually sort of has that phrase that it's like Constantine, who was famous for converting to Christianity because he saw a vision that said, in this sign, under this banner, you will conquer. And it was basically the sign of the cross. And so he used that became like associated with him, that under this sign you will conquer. And Crowley said he didn't conquer the enemy, he conquered the people with that sign. So it sort of like united everyone under the same banner in that respect, rather than having various religions all over the empire, even though, because it was a traditional Roman thing to have, you would accept, like you would invade a new place, you'd take over and set things in place, but you would allow them to continue their indigenous religion with a little bit of an amalgamation, in the sense of like, there would be some crossover. There would be probably at various stages veneration of the emperor as well, in addition to the local gods and that sort of thing. But it was a little bit more much more forgiving of like different points of view and different religions and that sort of thing, up until Christianity, which became much more uniform.
There's many more sort of little bits and pieces here that are I think worthy of discussion, but it sounds like we're sort of maybe running out of steam a little bit on our at least our prepared remarks, and the rest of it is just sort of more specific examples of like myths Crowley thinks were syncretized into Christianity, specific examples of cultural traditions of human sacrifice that are interesting and perhaps bear upon the question of what influenced the way we tell the Jesus story. Mm-hmm. So I think if you're happy to leave it there,
as a capper, I think I would love to read this one little paragraph from Crowley that seems to be a perfect way of closing it off.
Sure.
On the other hand, he says, if the New Testament be the composite document which it is here maintained to be in this essay, I am the truest of all Christians, says Crowley. I agree with practically every word reported of the Yogi Jesus, and nearly every word of the Essene. True, I reject salvationism and the Jewish element of prophecies fulfilled and the praise of the law of Moses. But trust humbly that any deficiency in these respects may be more than made up by superfluity in another. For not only do I hold the cult of John Barleycorn to be the only true religion, but have established his worship anew. In the last 3 years, branches of my organization have sprung up all over the world to celebrate the ancient rite. So mote it be.
Yeah, love Crowley's pitch for the OTO again.
Yeah.
Let me see. What do I want to say about that? I think it's funny that he says he's the most sincere Christian because he accepts these two faces of Jesus that I think are poorly attested while rejecting some of the stuff that's explicit.
Yeah. He's essentially doing exactly what he accused Shaw of, really, if you think about it.
Right.
Shaw's put up these two versions that are his versions and then chosen the one that he prefers.
At least those versions are explicitly in the text, whereas the Yogi Jesus is just extrapolated.
Yeah, exactly.
So what I would suggest is that we do, at some point, not tomorrow, but at some point, we can hit the Gospels one at a time in the way you would like to. I think at least Mark and John, Mark being the first of the Gospels that all agree with each other, and John being the weirdest outlier.
Yeah, the sort of Gnostic sounding one.
So then revisit this paper because the Gospel according to St. Bernard Shaw is divided up. Like it deals with Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and there are subheadings and long passages devoted to breaking down what he thinks of each of those Gospels. So we can talk about the Gospel of John and then read George Bernard Shaw on the Gospel of John, and then read Crowley on George Bernard Shaw on the Gospel of John, and get more out of it in that way. I finally got that joke. So you know how Crowley calls Blavatsky an 8-3 or something like that. He acknowledges Blavatsky as a saint because she founded an order, and all founders of orders have a default 8-3.
Honorary 8-3.
Yeah, honorary 8-3. So I thought St. Bernard Shaw was an honorific, and that Crowley was really... But it's a dog. It's a big fucking rescue dog. And I got that this morning.
I love that. Actually, now I have another quote that I want to go out on. So yeah, I'll just read this Crowley's glowing compliment where he says, the subject of the picture or the story is always the same. It is the eternal miracle of abounding life, ever self-restored, triumphant over death, the return of the Son and the resurrection of the seed, which makes even George Bernard Shaw, professional skeptic, iconoclast of romance, scourge of poets, break into lyrical prose. And then he quotes him, "He will not resist you nor reproach you, but will rise again in golden beauty amidst a great burst of sunshine and bird music, and save you and renew your life." Crowley picks it back up. It is indeed a triumph for solar phallic worship to add to the names of General Forlong, Sir Richard Burton, Sir R. Payne Knight, Messrs. Hargrave Jennings, Godfrey Higgins, Gerald Massey, and Theodore Royce, the name of Bernard Shaw. Thank you all for listening. Thank you for joining me, Michael.
Hey, nice to be here.
Have a good one in 93.
Love is the law, love under will.
Love is the law, love under will. Thanks for listening. Find Toronto Thelema online. Like, comment, share, and subscribe, and help us grow. And join us again in the darkly splendid abodes. Oh, I have. I'll give you a joke that I came up with here. You know the improv thing. I just want to demonstrate how improv works for the audience. So, you're familiar with improv, right?
I've improvised.
Yes. So the golden rule for improv is the whole yes and thing. Right?
Correct. Yeah.
Okay. So let's see if we can give a demonstration.
I should have said nope.
Yeah. Don't not yes and me. So let's see if we can give a demonstration here. Okay. I want you to start things off by you say, for instance, you're a character. You're a guy at a gas station attendant.
Okay. Hey, sir, regular or unleaded?
Yes, and. I figure I can take that one on the road.